to another episode of Bro History. It is Henry Zamota. Danny Abdeljabbar is stuck with a contractor, or at least that's the excuse that he gave me, so he will not be joining today's episode. So boo Danny, last minute cancellation, so typical. But we are greeted by our good friend Joseph Solis-Mullen. And Joseph Solis-Mullen, I wanted to talk to you, not only because we're friends, but also because there's some exciting news. You are running for Senate in Michigan on the Libertarian ticket. And I want to talk to you about that and then maybe some other things. But I guess first and foremost, how's the race going?
Well, it's good to be here, Henry. It's always great to chat with you. The race, how's it going? Well, it's going to cost many millions of dollars, whoever wins the race. So we're doing about as well as the average third party does. I clocked in at 3% in a recent poll. So that's about all I can ask for, really. Been doing events trying to highlight and the contrast, really, because despite the fact that many people have heard the word libertarian, they aren't entirely sure what a libertarian candidate represents, what a libertarian platform is. And so mostly what I've been using my opportunities to do is to message, to be a good standard bearer for the party, for the ideas that I'm representing, and hopefully trying to gin up some interest in the movement so that we can, sort of direct some people towards down ticket races, local races, which is where I view Libertarian Party candidates as having the most likely opportunities for success. So I was very dubious about taking this on. I was asked to do it repeatedly and finally did it, really as more of a favor than anything else. But because I don't think that major races like this are races that a third party can win for all the reasons that everyone always brings up. The races cost a lot of money. The first past the post electoral system really benefits the two parties, et cetera, et cetera. So, gave a talk on the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship, the current war there. Just did another one on libertarian monetary and fiscal policy and regulatory policy. And then I have another one coming up here soon in Ann Arbor about the drug war and other social issues. So that's pretty much it.
So when a libertarian runs for a Senate seat, is it typically like a messaging campaign more so than an attempt to, I guess, represent the people of that state in the Senate?
Yeah, I think it needed to be. And when they first reached out to me, which was, almost 2 years ago, libertarian circles are not terribly big. I work at the Libertarian Institute. I have something of an elevated profile, so people reached out to me, said, hey, we really want to run a really aggressive campaign for Senate. It was known well in advance that it was going to be Alyssa Slotkin and Mike Rogers, who are really ideal candidates for libertarians to try to paint a stark contrast with, because they are so ideologically similar to one another. Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin really wonderfully represent all the things that are wrong with the Uniparty. And so and I told them, I said, look, it's true what you say about them, but there is not the slightest chance a libertarian is going to win the Senate race in Michigan. It's one of the only purple states. Both parties are going to spend whatever money is necessary. They're going to exclude any third party candidate from any debates. I don't want to try and knock 10,000 doors. We're going to get 3%, whether you knock those doors or not. That's not how I view the top of the party, the top of the ticket candidates for our party. It needs to be more about messaging and stimulating interest in the party to help our down ballot candidates where we actually have a chance. So eventually they contacted me again, said, we've thought about it, we would be okay with kind of doing it the way that you'd like to do it. And that was several months ago. And I was like, well, it's a little late in the day for this. I would really have wanted to get started a while ago. But, I'm a nice guy. I know the people in the party, they're good people. They work hard. And, I wanted to help them out. And so here I am. And so, yeah, like I said, I've been giving talks, kind of trying to educate people really about what libertarianism is and isn't, and what the actual policy prescriptions look like. So, and trying to really highlight the true difference between an anti-statist and a statist, which Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin are both intensely statist politicians. And it's one of the reasons that the campaign, I don't expect anyone really listening to this to be really tuned into the Michigan Senate race, but I get probably a dozen flyers a week. Anytime I try and turn on the television, or the kids try and turn on the television, we get bombarded with these ads. They're all about guns and abortion. That's it. That's all the ads are about. That and like just straight character assassination stuff, because they don't actually disagree on really a lot else. They both think that we should continue the forever wars, don't worry about the debt, don't touch entitlements, continue the surveillance state. There's really no significant difference between them if you take guns and abortion off the table. And you could say that about a lot of uniparty politicians, but so that's basically what's been going on. I did a piece for a newspaper over in Oakland County yesterday. Did a spot for a Grand Rapids news program a couple days before that. So, I'm taking any media requests that come my way as a candidate. But yeah, so that's pretty much it. That's how I view the race, and hopefully we'll be able to stimulate interest in the party, grow the membership, and be able to long-term target local races, win local races, build, good grassroots bases in maybe a couple of different areas that then can serve as a launching point for maybe a congressional campaign. A congressional campaign in the right district could be winnable, but you need boots on the ground, and you need some money. So that's sort of how I view the best strategy for a third party going forward is. So
I'm just looking at some of the main campaign financiers for Slotkin and Mike Rogers. There's two Mike Rogers. There's one in Alabama. So I was like fumbling around, like which one's the correct one. But
it's the one who sits on the board of the Atlantic Council.
Okay, that tells us a lot that we need to know. But just like looking at the donors, it's like so typical. So it's like what you would accuse if you were a Democrat and you were like, oh, you're funded by XYZ. So Slotkin is funded by Gates, Soros, Alan Blue, the founder of LinkedIn, Salman Al-Rashid, I don't know who that is, the Larry Bell, a bunch of people from Blackstone, a bunch of hedge fund managers, and then the primary donors for Mike Rogers are seems to be a lot of Sheldon Adelson. I mean, he is dead, so I guess the donations are in the name of Sheldon Adelson, from Miriam Adelson. And then we have Charles Koch, we got Peter Thiel, and then we have a bunch of other hedge fund managers. So yeah, I guess it is pretty hard to compete at a national level, especially during a important election year for the two major parties. But like you said, I mean, I don't really know too much about these candidates. Neither do I know very much about Michigan's political culture, if it's different from like other Midwestern cities, other Midwestern states. It has a couple of
interesting things about it.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that, because I'll just give you a comparison. New York does not have obviously New York's political culture is surrounded by or revolves around New York City. So in New York, New York City is a one party city. It's all Democrats. There's really no chance in hell that a Republican will ever be elected mayor of New York City again. But the interesting thing about New York is that since it's a one party city, you get these really the Democrats actually bifurcate. They split up, and you get these really nasty political factions within the Democratic Party, and that's why it's one of the reasons why I'm sure a lot of people know about Eric Adams being indicted. It's one of the reasons why Eric Adams is going down kicking and screaming right now. It's because there is actually that political culture where there is. I mean, he's corrupt as hell, and he's probably guilty. I guess he has to receive his day in court. But there is that political culture where they're like vultures. Like, they really, really attack people. But outside of New York City, where I live in Long Island now, it's like 50-50 Republican Democrat. Most Republicans are not pro-liberty type Republicans. They're most of them are kind of like law and order type, which I would just say standard. Trump's very popular here. If you drive around my neighborhood, it's nothing but Trump flags. Basically, any white neighborhood is going to be primarily Trump flags outside. And then when you go to closer to the city, there's more Democrats. But the Republican culture revolves around supporting, like, backing the blue here and just immigration. Like, those are the two primary reasons why people would be voting Republican is law and order and immigration. But I'm curious to hear, because Michigan's a bigger state. There's obviously more, or not a bigger state, but it's a more, I imagine it's a little bit more diverse. It's in the heartland of America. So why don't you kind of explain why or if that would be a good place to, strategize around creating interest for more local elections?
Well, I think the opportunities for libertarians are going to be few and far between anywhere. And that's because, despite what many libertarians like to tell themselves, and you may have heard this, they'll say, most people are libertarians, they just don't know it yet. That's not true. It's just not true. There are very few people who are actually committed political libertarians. There are people who like this policy or that policy, but they aren't actual libertarians. And so
they're just Republicans
really
who want to smoke pot.
yeah.
How much have you? How often do you hear that? They're just Republicans who just want to smoke pot.
Plenty. And so issue coalition wise, like, yes, you can team up, with various groups on an issue by issue basis. Ending the drug war, for example, be fine to create a coalition with progressives or something like that. Creating Second Amendment sanctuary cities would be fine to, partner with Republicans who are interested on that, etc. But I actually, let me first address the broader political culture, and then that will help me segue into where I think the actual opportunities might be for libertarians here in Michigan. So you're right. Michigan is a huge state. It's absolutely gigantic because we have the Upper Peninsula as well, and it's also just a pretty big state if you look at it on a map. We have that same urban-rural divide. You can almost one-to-one call whether it's going to go red or blue based on its population density. So it's very similar to the rest of the country in that way. We do have some interesting demographic factors that can affect cycles just depending on what's going on. And one of the biggest ones right now, the big question mark, is how much is the Dearborn area going to show up for Alyssa Slotkin and Kamala Harris? That's a critical area. It's a very high population density blue area, but it is the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the entire country. And a very large block of them voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries. I've followed Alyssa Slotkin's statements about what's going on in Gaza very thoroughly. I mean, since it started, because I knew I wasn't running at the time, but I knew it was going to be interesting because she had already been, crowned the, successor to Stabenow, and I knew she was going to have to walk a very, very fine line there, to not piss off the donor class, but not alienate those really critical voters. And I think it's going to be a real question whether they show up for her or not, and for Kamala Harris, because without them showing up, they're not going to win Michigan. Michigan gets decided by tens of thousands of votes. I mean, it is a true purple state. So that's a critical one there. So, and that's an interesting one. The only other state that really has that going on in the Midwest is Minnesota. Minnesota has that as well. Just a small, tight concentration there in a population-dense area of Arab Americans who can really swing an election one way or the other. In terms of opportunities for libertarians, there are vast areas of the upper part of the lower peninsula. If any of your listeners are looking at a map of Michigan, the lower portion of the state that looks like a mitten, the upper part of that mitten, outside of Traverse City and Mackinac, a lot of times Democrats don't run anyone in opposition to the Republicans up there. There are so few Democrats up in those areas. They go blue all the time, and they're not like very high population density areas. Republicans run unopposed in those areas. I think those are areas where, with the right groundwork, the right messaging, libertarians could potentially make inroads there and steal a congressional seat by running to the right of Republicans on certain issues. Like, there's a guy named Moulander. I think he's still there. It's been many years now since I lived up there, but I reckon he's probably still parked up there. Who would sign any omnibus bill, was very not in line with sort of the America First isolationist sentiment of the early Trump movement. And, you could definitely see primarying a guy like that and knocking him out, being better on guns, being better on cutting spending, being better on attacking the debt and entitlements. That's where I think libertarians would have their best opportunity to get a congressional seat. Not because, we're Republicans who like to smoke pot, but because just on a handful of issues, you could probably get them, because like marijuana it's been legal for a long time now in Michigan, and it just does not have the cultural punch that it would have had 20 years ago. Because someone like a Moulander or someone like that could try and attack you as a libertarian running to the right of him in a Republican primary and say, well, he wants to have more pot or something like that. And it's like, that's just not something that's going to like grab people the way that it used to. So I think that's probably, from a strategic standpoint, that would be the best thing you could do, because you could run the race cheap and it would be head to head. It wouldn't be a three-way race. Because the problem with being the third party is many people view it as just a wasted vote. They say, well, the third party candidate for president is not going to win, which is true. And I don't want to waste my vote. And so I just decide which candidate I hate more or less, however you want to phrase it. And they just vote for the lesser of two evils. And while I certainly understand that, I've voted black and gold myself since I became politically active. I don't see why you should support Republicans and Democrats. If you literally believe that they're both terrible, and you recognize that Republicans and Democrats together have put us in the place where we are now. In the last 20 years, we've had a Republican president with a Republican Congress, a Republican president with a split Congress. We've had a Democratic president with a Democratic Congress, a Democratic president with a split Congress. We've had every possible combination. And the policies have never changed. They've all been going in the same direction the whole time for 20 years. And the idea that if you just vote for Republicans and Democrats one more time or two more times, everything's going to be better, to me, it just seems nonsensical. And, you obviously have people who say, oh, well, you're going to hand this election to that person or this person or that person, which there's never really been any solid, quantitative work to back any of that up. Every side always blames the third parties for stealing their votes, quote unquote, but they aren't their votes. there's plenty of people who are going to sit at home on election day, completely disgusted by politics, who don't want to vote. And it's certainly not our fault that, the handful of people who vote Libertarian or Green Party or whatever refuse to endorse the duopoly and refuse to endorse the status quo, because it's a clear failure. And I don't want to be complicit in it, frankly.
Well, if you were to steal votes, those votes would most likely be from Mike Rogers, correct? But you wouldn't be stealing. Like, a Democrat's not going to vote. It's most likely not going to cross the aisle and go from Democrat to Libertarian. If anything, they'll go Green.
Yeah, I think the Green Party is where most of the disaffected Democrats would go. Especially with the Palestine issue being front and center. But I think it really just depends. I've had people contact me via my Senate email, describing their political affiliation and just ask me, like, I really, from both sides, who have just said, I just can't do it. What's your position on this or that? And I feel like I have a lot of positions that people can agree with. I describe myself as fiscally conservative and socially fairly liberal. I'm like I hate to say it, but if you had to peg me, like, a Clinton Democrat would probably be like the closest thing, that like a 90s, we have to cut spending, just leave people alone in their private lives. Like, that to me is a fine step in the right direction. It's not the whole journey to where I'd like us to go, but it's certainly better than where we are now. Cut taxes, deregulate, cut entitlements, balance the budget, leave people alone in their private lives. It's hard for people to remember because it's become so clouded and toxic with like the legacy of like Bill Clinton and Hillary and, Newt Gingrich and his, bastards who went on to, do what they did. But really, the 90s, there was some really solid legislating going on there in terms of trying to get the country on sound fiscal footing. And that all got destroyed by, George W. Bush and Nancy Pelosi and everyone had a hand in it, except for like a couple of people like Thomas Massie, who votes no on everything. Which hats off to him. But yeah, I don't know. Even like the really quote unquote progressive voices in Congress are just like totally in the pocket of the same forces that pretty much dictate policy. Bernie Sanders votes for the F-35 program, right? Because it's good manufacturing jobs, like, what are you talking about?
So, yeah, well, a lot of these progressives, there's a hack to get progressives to vote the way that you want them to, or that big business can get them to vote the way they want them to, and that is through bribery. So you have guys like Richie Torres, who are like, super duper progressive, but then they're like completely bankrolled by AIPAC, and they just vote for everything that's, their primary concern is appeasing their AIPAC donors. But what's interesting is that, so my friend, I don't know if you know Matthew Ho. So he ran on the Green Party ticket in North Carolina 2 years ago in 2022. And he was actually going to steal. I mean, that's what the Democrats thought, that he was going to steal votes. And they really engaged in some really nasty and devious tactics against this campaign. So you're probably aware, you probably know who Elias Law Group. So Elias Law Group is Mark Elias, right? I think it's Mark Elias. So he like runs like a field office, like a battalion of lawyers that like go down and do and manage elections and engage in like political warfare. So essentially what they did is that they had these operatives in North Carolina. They had them essentially take public records of Green Party signatories, and then they contacted the people who signed this petition saying that they were going to support the Green Party, misrepresented themselves as Green Party affiliates, and then encouraged them to withdraw their petition, their signature. And they basically said that if you don't vote Democrat, then you're going to lose abortion rights. And the Green Party endorses the message. So they actually went in fraud. They engaged in actual fraud to derail the campaign. And it's a crazy story. You can read all about it if you search it on the interwebs. But there's other shenanigans too. They also like were constantly telling them they didn't have enough signatures to get on ballot. Like, it was all this crazy stuff that they had to go with just because he could swing the election, like, but he by 2 points. So I was curious to see if any of those types of tactics. I wouldn't imagine the tactics would be so severe, but if you've ever received or while running this campaign, you've received pressure from Republican groups to withdraw.
Yeah, and I always tell them the same thing. It's not my problem if you lose this election with your garbage candidate. There are 8 million registered voters in Michigan, and barely 5 million of them show up for any given election. So the fact that you need, quote unquote, 500,000 votes from libertarians is not our problem. Your problem is that you couldn't convince millions of people to get off the couch and vote for your crap candidate because people know what he is. That's always been my line. Like, it's not third parties' problems. If voter turnout was literally 100%, then maybe we're having a conversation. Okay, maybe I am stealing your votes, but I'm not stealing your votes. I can tell you right now, if there were no libertarian on the ballot, I literally wouldn't vote. Or I might vote, or I might show up and like write people in. I've written Ron Paul in for president before. I might just show up and write a bunch of people in for myself if the line wasn't too long. But really, I would not participate if there was no one. It's not like if it was only Democrats and Republicans, I still wouldn't vote for them. I disagree with their policies and do not want to be complicit in their policies. And it appears that millions of other people feel the same way. Otherwise, they'd go out and vote for them. So, yeah, I've been contacted by Republican groups, and I just always tell them the same thing. So
it's interesting because last year, and this is mainly due to early ballot access and mail-in votes, you see record voting turnout. I think, and I thought this, I've been thinking this for the past basically over the past couple of years, that I think this will be a significantly lower amount of voters in this election. I'm honestly, man, I feel like this election is almost in the background. Like, I don't feel it consuming me. Like, I don't feel it in the air. I think a lot of people are disengaged from it. I'm not embargoed by constant political propaganda like I was in 2020 or 2019. And I just feel like I think people are just checked out.
I mean, voter turnout continues to increase. I'm looking at the turnout numbers here. I mean, the interesting thing to me is that even though the policies are not changing, even though more and more people say it's broken, it's not working, we need to do something different, more and more people keep turning out to vote. 2020 was the highest level of voter participation that we've had. It really departed the trend line of about the 62% that we'd been on for quite some time. So going back decade and a half in terms of presidential cycles, that is. So you had almost 70% turnout. And again, millions and millions of people are sitting at home refusing to participate, as you said, but that is actually fewer people who had been sitting at home. So obviously the population's increasing, but I think it's still accurate. I'd have to run that to see whether or not that tracks, but just looking at it, eyeballing it, it looks about right. So again, I think about the kind of messaging that the campaigns are engaging in. if you don't vote for Donald Trump, you won't have a country anymore. America will literally die or something. And if you vote for Donald Trump, you also won't have a country anymore. Like, they're literally the messaging that is the messaging is so extreme. The messaging is so extreme. And it clearly does work on some level to get people that psychologically energized to get out and vote. Even people, and this is just anecdotal from my own life, you know, people who I've known my whole life who were never political, never, or at least never very political, will get this crazed look in their eye when they talk about Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And like, guys, he's been president. She's been in the White House for years. Like, do you honestly think things are going to change that much? They're not. They're really not. I mean, we're on a super bad trajectory, but your concern isn't that we're on a bad trajectory. It's that the other side might win. And I mean, to me, it's, I don't know. The literature on voter rationality is not terribly comforting. It's just, you know, number one, most voters just are not terribly informed. That's been well documented going back many decades. But the really disheartening stuff isn't just that they're uninformed, it's that they have a literal incentive to be irrational in their political support, that it is rational for them to behave irrationally. Because the cost of becoming a high information voter is so arduous, tracking the news cycle every day, being educated about the issues, so time intensive, and your single vote counts for so little, especially if you don't live in a swing state. Your vote basically counts for nothing, that you're better off, that it's more rational for you to just pick a team and to enjoy the psychological serotonin, the neurochemical reward that your brain gets for cheering for your team and hating the other side, you know? So I'm just very pessimistic about that kind of stuff. But, you know, I'm a professional. I do study this stuff as part of my living. So, you know, I remember once upon a time when I was an undergraduate and I thought, gosh, soon with the internet and everything, everyone will have all the right information and everyone will stop arguing about things. Gosh, that was so fanciful.
Yeah, I've noticed that. So, you know, for years, everyone's been saying, oh, the alt media is going to take over. And the alt media has taken over. And most of it is just Republican, like, slop. It's like a lot of it is just a lot of like I feel like a lot of the podcasting scene is mostly aligned with Trump, like a lot of the big podcasters, and most of it is just kind of like just brain slop. Like there's really nothing informative. You know, a lot of most of my friends are going to be voting for Trump, and you know the stuff that they listen to is like so dumb. Like they listen to I don't know if you not to stir stuff with, and these podcasts are so much bigger than my show, so it's like not even it's I don't feel bad talking shit about them, but they watch like Tim Pool, and I watched that show before.
I wondered if that was the example you were going to reach for.
Yeah, man, I think that's like one of the dumbest.
I put myself through a couple of episodes.
I've watched that. I've watched the episodes where like Scott Horton's on it, and then I've just like listened to this idiot talk over Scott. I was like, oh my God, this is so painful. You're talking to a brilliant person and you're interrupting them over and over and over again, and you just don't know anything. But I have friends who like listen to all of this stuff, and they're like, oh man, have you seen the last Tim Pool? And I'm like, no, I haven't. I watched bits and pieces. The guy's a complete moron. But yeah, there's other shows that are very adjacent to that. And, you know, they have these huge audiences, like, you know, millions and millions of people watch them. They listen to these shows. And a lot of it is just kind of just brain slop. Like your content does so much better. You know, if we were to divert this show's efforts and we were just like, hey, let's just make like anti-social justice warrior stuff, then immediate hit, because that's the type of stuff that you crave. Like you crave, you want to see, you want to humiliate your foe. You know what I mean? Like you want to just see your foe humiliated on stage. So, you go and you search the internet for, oh, look at this Kamala lesbian voter. She doesn't even know who the first president. It's like something so dumb.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right there, and that's what I mean with the psychological dimension, the behavioral dimension of what we're talking about here, and it is very easy to hack that and manipulate it, and I definitely hear you. My sister recently started seeing someone who's a huge fan of the Daily Wire, and it's just,
oh boy.
he's just
one of my best friends is a big fan of Shapiro, and I was like, and I always make fun of him for it, and he's like, "Shut up, anti-Semite!" Like he's joking when he says that, but I'm like,
the thing is he's such a well-meaning guy. Not Ben Shapiro, he's awful, but just the average guy.
Really?
Like, they're really like normal guys, totally well-meaning, But then someone will mention something about like Palestine, they'll be like, well, Israel totally has the right to defend itself. What, do you love Hamas? It's like, what do you even know about Hamas? And it's like, well, nothing, really. It's like, yeah, so why are you all fired up about this, dude? Not that you can't be fired up about it, but like, you know nothing about it. You're fired up because some asshole told you to be fired up about it and told you what to think, and you were like, yeah, let's own those fucking social justice people, Because that's really who it's associated with here in Michigan. Is it's really associated with a left-wing cause, being anti-Israel's war. So, and he drives through Ann Arbor pretty regularly on his way to work. So, yeah, it's just sad because like there's really no reason for Americans to get fired up about really anything that happens. Number one, anything that happens outside of America. None of that matters to us. I was reading something the other day in the Wall Street Journal, which, God, I hate the Wall Street Journal so much, but you know me, I read the corporate press every day. The Wall Street Journal's just been so horrible lately. They were saying something about this threat that Iran poses to America's national security strategy. And it was like, oops, I don't think you're supposed to say that bit. I think you're just supposed to say national security, guys. I think you're just supposed to say Iran is a threat to our national security. That's the line. Because the strategy of attempted global hegemony, that's not really what you're supposed to say out loud. You're just supposed to say our national security. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so ridiculous. Like, nothing that any country in the world could do really affects our national security terribly. Certainly nothing Iran does. But, if they and Israel get into a scuffle and, the Israelis assassinate someone, in Tehran, and Tehran sends a bunch of drones over towards Israel, we're supposed to believe that in some way affects our security. But it isn't. It affects the security strategy, the vision of the world that Beltway hacks who don't have a real living imagine would be great. But it has nothing to do with our well-being. So, yeah. But again, they use it to get people terribly fired up, get people at each other's throats. Yeah, it's just awful.
I mean, I wish people knew more about these foreign policy issues, because if they did, then they would not be so brain dead. But it's just the real fact, and this is something I've come to terms with, is that people are just not that interested. Like people are not very interested in understanding like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or like what are the roots of that, like what really led up to that. People are a little bit more on the right, willing to understand maybe the complexities of the war due to it being an issue in this election. But other than that, other than a way to like kind of slam dunk on the libs or the Democrats, it's not really something that people think about. Same thing with Israel-Palestine. Like people just, like most Jews I know don't really know that much about the conflict. They're just kind of like, yeah, I've been to Israel on birthright, and I love Israel, and I made friends with some IDF soldiers. But other than that, like they don't really know that much about the conflict. So it's like you're not people are just concerned with like their immediate surroundings for the most part, like their career, their job, their social groups. If they have families, their families, obviously. They're not too interested in taking the time to understand some foreign conflict because it takes a lot of work and a lot of study. Like, you're never going to understand the Russia-Ukraine conflict by reading a couple of articles from the Wall Street Journal, or even vice versa, reading a couple of articles from the Wall Street Journal and then reading, some more nuanced articles from like the Quincy Institute or something like that. Like, you're not going to understand a conflict. It takes serious time to, read books and to dive into the topic. And frankly, people just don't see the return on doing that. Like you said earlier, I mean, people don't see the return on studying a foreign policy issue because they're complicated. And the deeper you dive into a lot of these foreign policy issues, a lot of times they become more boring, and people just want the juicy stuff. So it's sometimes it's kind of a fool's errand. The only thing that you can really do is explain how that foreign policy issues is impacting their home life. And that's about it. But unless you can, like, with the Iraq War being the perfect example, or the Vietnam War, even a better example, I mean, people knew people who died there. People understood that these projects were just kind of big, money pits. And they, you saw the reports of like guys getting their faces blown off. That's when people will turn against it. But the state that we are in now, where the U.S. basically has adopted like what the British did in like the 16th century, just use privateers everywhere, where everything is just a mercenary army. And like, basically our Legion, like the U.S. Army is basically the Ukrainian army. Like that's the U.S. Army right there. I don't see a real distinction between the Ukrainian army and the U.S. Army. It would be like if the Romans, it's just like a garrison in fucking Gaul of Roman troops. Maybe those troops aren't from Rome, but they're fighting on behalf of the Roman Empire. So people, since people don't know people who are dying there, it's like none of their concern, and the money's all fake. Like people have gotten so used to just pumping out dollars, just a printing press, that it's just like money is fake to everyone. So it's a hard task to connect those dots with most people.
Yeah, and I think that's by design. I mean, it gives you a free hand if you are part of the security establishment, which let's be real, they're exceedingly powerful, and it's not some small cabal who's secretly running things. It's just these massive institutions that have grown up and grown together over many decades, who all have similar interests. They have no need to coordinate policy, although from time to time they do. They have workshops and whatnot, but for the most part it's simply a matter of each of them pursuing their own interests. And as you said, it's just not in the interest of the average person to really care about these things. I mean, they're not being really taxed to pay for these things. I mean, that's why our military budget is now $1 trillion a year, and we're facing $2 trillion a year deficits from now until well into the 2030s. And I just ask American listeners, I mean, people who listen to your show are no doubt well aware of this, but guys, I mean, we're talking about hitting $50 trillion before we hit the year 2030. And this is not even the real debt. The real debt is way scarier, because the real problem is all the unfunded liabilities that Washington is already on the hook to pay out, and that no one is willing to even talk about cutting. I mean, we're $200 trillion in the hole if we add up all the promises that Washington has made. There's no way to get rid of that stuff other than inflating it away. Mitch McConnell actually mentioned raising taxes the other day, so I don't know if he fell down the stairs again or something. You're definitely not supposed to say that. But Yeah, it's a horrible mess. The dollars are fake. I get that same sort of, like, I was on the continent over the summer, and you know, just it's hard not to view the political leadership of Germany as, like, like our proconsul in Germany. You know what I mean? Especially because Olaf Scholz is just such
Oh
a
yeah, they
weak
definitely are.
doofus. You know what I mean? Like, he doesn't even look like he can stand on his own feet. Um, you know, and yeah, I mean, they're America's frontline troops. Although I mean, it's definitely been, I think, a wake up call, to European elites to realize that allowing Washington to dictate policy could wind up exploding in a war right on their doorstep that none of them are prepared to really seriously help fight. I mean, they can turn on their own printing presses and supply money and stuff. But I remember early in the war when, or actually it would have been a year into the war, when the Germans were finally like, all right, we'll dust off some tanks and send them to you. They had very few, nowhere near enough. And even the United States' own industrial base is very strained. Especially when you look at, the new national security strategies that have been put forward by the Trump and Biden administrations. I mean, they're entertaining fighting a multi-theater war, being able to fight Iran and China and fight proxy war with Russia all at the same time. And this, apart from the human cost, which would just be, oh, I mean, just difficult to even fathom what that could look like. It is really hard to see, how the American economy can function normally. I mean, it really feels like the state would have to step in. People forget that World War II was, actually a time of tremendous privation. It was a time when your factory was being taken over by the government, when your electricity was being rationed, when critical materials were not available. That tends to get lost, especially as those people who lived through, the last actual war we fought, of the kind that, Beltway hacks imagine we should go fight again. The people who actually lived those experiences are dying off. Um, I mean, they're in their late 80s, 90s now. Um, you know, most people have never even met someone who lived through the Great Depression or World War II. Um, so not as adults anyway.
Well,
Maybe
that's a
as a
good point you
child.
raise. Let's actually zoom into this because I think this is something interesting. The political culture of the United States was much different 80 years ago to where, all right, we get into a war with the commies. I'll send my son over there to go fight. I don't think we have a political culture now that to do that. Um, how it's like the Korean War, we lost roughly what 50,000 total, or um and it's like called America's forgotten war because it wasn't a big deal compared to the wars it was in between, being World War II and Vietnam. Like the casualty rate was lower in those wars. I'm actually thinking like what the casualty rate, what the total casualties in Vietnam and Korea were. I think they're roughly kind of similar, but
Yeah,
Vietnam,
the Vietnam War was a little more costly. I think like 20,000 more guys got killed. A lot more guys got wounded, if I remember correctly. But yeah, casualties for the Korean War were lower,
but
but
the
about on a
political,
par.
you had people who were, I guess, willing to sacrifice back then. Um, there was this common culture that I think people were willing to fight over, fight for, even if you don't agree with the wars. Now it's like you want to fight a multi-front war against the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians. Like, good luck finding recruits for that.
Over what, right? And
Yeah,
that's the thing, is you pointed out that in
like fighting
both
communism makes
the
sense.
World War
Fighting the
II, Korea, Vietnam, you were able to paint it as part of a grand narrative that really spoke to something about who we imagined we were. And that can motivate sacrifice. I know that you pay very close attention to the news cycle. There's been an attempt by the Biden administration to paint what's going on as a new conflict between freedom and totalitarianism, right? But they really dropped that rather quickly, right? It was, I had a couple articles on it. I think it was about 2 years ago, right when the war first started, but it immediately fell apart. It immediately fell apart because even the most unaware person could be like, wait, didn't we just give like a couple $1 billion to Egypt the other day? You know what I mean? Aren't we like close with the Saudis? What are they again? And so they just dropped it, you know? And so it's, I don't know. Like you said, I just don't think there's an ability to motivate the kind of sacrifice that you would need to get out of the population to get them to fight these kind of wars. So, which increases the importance of, like you said, sort of the proxy forces, like using the Ukrainian army. I think the United States would really love to get the Indians more engaged in trying to contain China. That's been one of the really interesting geopolitical dances to watch over the past several years, is watching Washington trying to prod India more in line with their preferred China policies, and India just kind of like, I'll do it here, I'll do it there. Because you need frontline states who are going to be willing to sacrifice large amounts of population if you want to fight these wars. And the American public, you're right. I think in another conversation you had used the phrase can't take casualties. That Americans today just can't take casualties.
Can't. We can't. If a guy dies in a training accident, it's a big deal. If one troop dies, it's a big deal. Like, everyone hears about it. That's just one soldier. And 20 years ago, and I'm not devaluing the life of that soldier. I'm just saying, in comparison, during the Iraq War, there'd be, dozens of casualties a week. Dozens of guys killed in action a week during the war on terror. And, those guys were motivated. Like, the guys I know who signed up to go fight in Iraq and Afghanistan were fucking motivated because we were attacked. But now we just don't have it, unless there was some really weird thing that happened. And I'm not even sure if there was like a 9/11 type attack in America that people would be that motivated in this state as it is to get to go embark in some escapade or crusade to conquer somebody. Like, I think people are too polarized. I think there's like a lack of shared culture in the U.S. at this point, where I don't think that people would even, they would care, but they wouldn't care that much to go to see their Marine recruiter and join up, especially young men. So I don't see us ever having the manpower, going back to the point, relying on proxies. I think the proxy force, and the region way better than I do, that I always saw as, probably the ideal proxy for the U.S. would be for China would be Vietnam. What are your thoughts on, do you know anything about the relationship between the U.S., not the U.S., well, I guess the U.S., Vietnam, China?
That does matter, yeah. Yeah, I did. I actually just wrote an article a couple of weeks about it.
Oh, really?
And
okay.
And then right after that, some Vietnamese fishermen were attacked by Chinese vessels near the Spratlys, which I thought was just such a foolish thing to be doing on the part of the Chinese. Because it's, just in the same way that they were uber belligerent with the Indians, and that pushed the Indians. We talked about that years ago when that melee happened up in the mountains. And that really pushed the Indians hard in the direction of the American camp when they had really been standing aloof. And Vietnam has tried very, very hard to stand equidistant between Beijing and Washington, even though Washington has courted them very aggressively and doing stupid stuff like that when, for many, many years, Beijing has handled Hanoi's building and fishing near the Spratlys, which they both contest, differently than how they handle the Philippines, because the Philippines are very obviously seen as a vehicle for American influence in the region. Then that's why they've handled it differently usually. But this marked a stark departure in business as usual there. So it's still kind of waiting to see what comes of that. I just wanted to go back to something you were just saying about deaths per week, because I can remember we would watch the news before school every day. We had like a homeroom class, and they would always turn on this news program. And, I can remember there'd be, a dozen deaths this week, or something like that during Iraq War II. During World War II, we were losing 1,500 guys a week. 1,500 guys a week. And when the island hopping campaign started, some of the first battles, the casualty rates were so high, the generals were so shocked, and the American public was totally outraged, because it was like, wait a minute, we lost how many guys fighting over what? That little rock out there in the ocean? It's a speck. I can't even see it on the map. Whereas something like the Battle of the Bulge, like, okay, we're fighting for this area of, Belgium, trying to push the Nazis back into Germany, something like that. It was more understandable. And so it was one of the things that led to a reevaluation of American strategy towards what is called euphemistically strategic bombing, right? And this has become part of the American repertoire. And it's something that was deployed over Korea pretty indiscriminately. It was something that was, of course, applied over Vietnam and Cambodia. And it is just the application of just gross mass bombing, killing millions of civilians in the process. So being able to deploy vast amounts of firepower from standoff distance is something that the American military maintains the ability to do. But in the case of something like Iran or China, for example, the real problem is now you're dealing with countries who can punch back. Sure, in Vietnam, a pilot might get shot down. Sure, I mean, that really wasn't even a problem in Desert Storm or in the Second Iraq War. You were basically just able to. You had total escalation dominance. You had complete control over the theater. In the case of attacking Iran, the U.S. has very, very exposed military facilities all over the region that are well within range of Iranian missiles. In the case of China, it is very questionable whether or not the United States could even get close enough to intervene in a potential conflict over Taiwan because of the sheer investment in missile systems that the Chinese have. So it's a different world in a number of ways. And I worry that, number one, the American public does not understand the kind of cost that would be associated with fighting the number of wars that the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal want us to fight. I'm just going to pick on the Wall Street Journal today because I'm annoyed with them. And number two, the people, the policymakers, and the strategists, most of them, if you look at them, they're turning a little bit gray. They grew up and cut their teeth in the 90s during the unipolar moment, and their mindset seems to be ossified. They seem to believe that the United States is just going to be able to dictate the way things are going to go forever, and that just does not seem to be the case. And I wrote something many years ago about the British Empire, and how, despite having real material interests in the Americas, as the United States' power grew and disputes arose in the 1870s, in the 1880s, in the 1890s, British planners finally reached a point where they said fighting a war with the United States over interests in the Americas would just be completely ruinous to the empire. It's not a core interest. And they literally stopped contingency planning for a war with the United States by about the 1890s. And I think that that's the type of decision, and I'm not a fan of the empire. I would not support the continuation of the empire, but you just have to make, I think, if you are interested in preserving what remains of American power, you have to start retrenching at some point. You can't just keep throwing endless military buildups on the credit card, and trying to, control what happens 80 miles off the coast of China, or what happens right on the doorstep of Russia. And obviously that might lead to some outcomes that I wouldn't personally approve of, but I also don't think that it's my responsibility, nor do I want it to be my government's responsibility to try and prevent what I think are suboptimal things occurring elsewhere. A government that's powerful enough to do that is a government that's too powerful for my liking. So,
what do you think that there is, and going back to what I originally texted you for this episode to be about, what, historical tipping points, what would people be podcasting about 500 years ago? It's a conversation we started last week with who I had mentioned, Matt Ho, who ran for the Green Party Senate. But I was wondering if you could think of like an historical analogy, like the current predicament of the U.S. is similar to, the predicament that, XYZ nation or empire was in the year, XY, 1500 or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I think the World War I comparison is very apt. So I'm trying to think how much I want to say here. I'm going to assume that most of your regular listeners are quite familiar with how World War I developed. There was a confluence of structural factors and then some critical final decisions that ultimately kickstarted this war. The forces that had been involved had been building for some time. And I really look at our present moment this way. You have a power, a Thucydidean dynamic, a rising power, an established power. They're butting up against one another. There's some transitional friction over certain key areas here. In the case of the British Empire and the German Empire, of course, today we would be looking at China, the United States. A catalyzing incident occurs, and it's this accumulated set of circumstances that make this one instance something that no one can really back down from, or that they think they can't back down from. And in the case of the Austrians and the Russians, they all had internal political reasons for needing to go to war there. The French, territorial reasons, the Germans, strategic reasons. The British ultimately decide to use the pretext of Belgian neutrality to enter the war because they perceived a key, a core strategic interest to be at stake. And that was control over the channel ports, the low country channel ports facing England. The reason that they viewed this as a core strategic interest is because the German battle fleet could be on their shores overnight, basically. And that while the British Navy was larger and more powerful, it would require the British Navy to keep more ships near the home islands, and they had many, many global interests related to the empire, and that they simply couldn't allow the channel ports to fall into German hands because that would have fatally compromised the empire. That was their estimation. And so they went to war and bankrupted themselves and killed the best of a generation and never recovered. I feel like the United States is in a similar situation here. Is Taiwan valuable? Sure. Sure. Is it a core strategic interest? I would argue no, not even close. Not even close. Not that you can't make an argument about it, but it's not an argument that you can't defeat. It really isn't. It's not even an argument that you couldn't have defeated regarding the channel ports. And actually, the government, nearly collapses because some of the members, the liberal members who opposed the war, quit as a result of this incredibly fateful decision to enter this war. There is just no reason to do it, but there are not a million, literally, I'm being hyperbolic. There are many structural factors that are driving the United States and China closer to war. And it is within their power. There aren't as many moving parts. Like Taiwan is a moving part, but it's one. It's literally one moving part between them. North Korea is not going to be able to provoke something between them. South Korea isn't. Japan isn't. The Philippines aren't. Probably. Maybe you can count that as a second moving piece. In the case of World War I, there were a dozen moving pieces, which you know. So I really think that there should be a lot more deliberate and open conversation about the proper course for American policy. But of course it's just all wrapped up in hyperbole and exaggeration and ad hominem attacks. And the one I fear more actually opening up into a war, which I told you a couple of years ago, was I really feel like Iran would be the war, because Iran is, to quote Paul Wolfowitz, more doable. It's more doable. And Israel has such clout on the Hill, and they have such an interest in provoking a conflict between the two of them, especially as they try and finish what they're doing in Gaza and the West Bank. Yeah, I'm very, very nervous. I don't know if you saw Kamala's 60 Minutes interview the other day, but yeah, there just doesn't seem to be really much hope there. We are entering a very fateful period, I think, because yes, America's relative power is going to decline, just as other powers grow wealthier, develop more complex, mature economies and force capabilities, militarily, economically. But it doesn't need to be a precipitous decline. That will only happen if the United States chooses to plunge itself into a very, very foolish, possibly multi-theater conflict. So, yeah, I think the British decision to enter World War I is the best analogy that I can reach for there. And it's it's not perfect, like I said. The First World War had many moving parts, and there were causes going back hundreds of years in some cases for it. But you could probably make the same case about the United States in terms of its initial interventions in China, and then the disappointed hopes that were created by Wilson, and then the decision to intervene to prevent the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War, which was just so foolish. But yeah, here we are now.
Well, so with Iran, and that is the weakest out of the three main U.S. adversaries, so that would be the logical war to fight, or the most logical war to fight. However, I don't think the Pentagon thinks that we can actually fight a war with Iran. I think U.S. foreign policy, I think the way that this administration has been behaving, I mean, it's been disgraceful, first and foremost, but from my read on it, it seems like they prefer not to have a war. And if it wasn't for the intense pressure from the Israeli lobby, that they would most likely want to pursue some type of normalization with Iran, at least this administration. Because I don't know, something I've read, and I think it's pretty much confirmed, is that with Iran's attack or counterattack would be a better way to say it, firing roughly 200 missiles or so. The U.S. had launched about 6 months, like 6 months to a year's worth of interceptors to just for that one attack. The development of missile technology is or has always outpaced the development of missile defense technology. And the types of things that Iran can do if the US and Israel were to start bombing, the two key, either their nuclear facilities or their ability to produce oil, the types of things that Iran can do as a counter are pretty scary. And it's not that, first and foremost, they would probably start to build nuclear weapons. There's arguments that I don't necessarily believe this, but the people have been making the argument that they already have nuclear weapons. They obviously have the missile technology to deliver a warhead. And their other option is that they could shut down the Strait of Hormuz if they wanted to. And, they would, you would know better than I do, but how much they export all of their oil to Asia. I'm not sure what the percentage of Chinese oil comes from Iran, but I think last time I checked, it was around like 10% or so. I don't know. You probably know better than I do, but they're a big trading partner of China. They've also threatened to strike Saudi oil refineries if they were attacked, or if their oil industry was attacked. So the types of things, like the global economic consequences for a war with Iran would be absolutely dire. Like, it would make the Iraq war look like, chump, like the trillions we spent on the war on terror look like chump change. The vast economic problems. It's funny because I've actually read some people saying, well, now it's time to actually go back to Russia and normalize relations with Russia, so they can so we could trade oil with them. Well, they've already found other buyers of their oil. They're still selling their oil to China and India and the global south. So I don't know what these crazies are thinking when they say we need to start bombing their oil refineries and their nuclear plants, because they could definitely do some major damage. Yeah, in like a zero-sum game, if there was a war and it was treated like a zero-sum game, like we need to conquer Iran and put an American flag on Tehran, I think the U.S. could probably achieve it, but at tremendous cost. And there's no way we're going to put boots on the ground to like march into Iran. If they were going to attack Iran, and I'm kind of convinced this is kind of the game in Lebanon as well, is that they would try to spark some type of civil war, because Iran is a very diverse country. There's a lot of people who are not happy with the current regime. There's a lot of disgruntled ethnic minorities in Iran, and they would use those groups as a way to tear the country apart. So I think that would be their preferred option. Just find a way to cause some civil war. But I don't think that's going to happen. Like, I think if that were to happen, if that was achievable, it would have happened already. If anything, the state is probably becoming more nationalist around the flag in Iran, especially since the start of the conflict. in Palestine last year. So I don't think there's a military solution at all for any of the conflicts that are going on right now.
No, and I agree
Russia,
with
China, and Iran.
I agree with everything you said there. I can remember the Pentagon telling George W. Bush, like, we're not going to go fight a war with Iran, so you can just chill that out right now. Iran's topography is incredible, number one. It would be impossible to get the American people to go along with what it would take for an invasion. Like we talked about earlier, the U.S. has so many assets in the area that would just be totally exposed to an Iranian counterattack. And no, I don't think that the Iranians have a bomb at this point. They say we don't have a bomb. The inspectors said they didn't have a bomb. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and the Wall Street Journal editorial board say that they are just this close to having nuclear weapons, but the CIA just a couple months ago was like, yeah, they don't. So it's just war hawk propaganda, just nonsense. At the same time, I do think that the war aims of the Israeli government have developed in a way where they view the expansion of the war as a good cover for finishing the ethnic cleansing in Gaza and for also possibly resolving the West Bank issue. I mean, the amount of settler violence going through with bulldozers, just destroying everything, running people out of there. I mean, if you've looked at a map, I know you've looked at a map, there's no viable Palestinian state in the West Bank. There's too many settlers everywhere. And Netanyahu has never made any bones about the fact that there's not going to be a Palestinian state. It's going to be an Israeli state. And, you know, just since things have started in Lebanon already, you know, Gaza's off the front pages, buried in the back. I mean, the Iranians don't want a conflict. At the same time, they can't simply sit there and do nothing. This goes all the way back to April, when they literally telegraphed well in advance that they were going to have to retaliate against Israel. Let's see, they had bombed the Iranian embassy in Syria, and then they went and assassinated that guy right in the middle of Tehran when he was there to attend the presidential inauguration. And again, all of this stuff is just kind of like, yeah, well, you know. But again, if the shoe is on the other foot, strategic empathy, Americans would freak the fuck out if someone did that to us. But never mind, it's the bad guys, so we don't care. They literally told the Americans and Israelis well in advance, here's what we're going to send the drones over. And then they had like a 5-hour flight time with plenty of time to shoot stuff down, right? And that was their response. The most recent missile attack, they literally were peppering sites outside of the city. Handful of people were killed, right? And they recognize they have to respond in some way to what is happening, these escalations against them. But they've said from the very start that, look, we don't want an escalation. We would like to actually be able to sit down with the U.S. administration. But, you know, that's just not what's going to happen. I mean, the pressure is incredibly intense. I think that the chance to reset the Iranian relationship has come and gone, has totally come and gone. I certainly agree that from the U.S. military's perspective, they gain nothing from a possible conflict with Iran. But I think the chance to reset that relationship came and went when Obama got the JCPOA done over the lobby's vociferous criticism. Trump ripped it up. He's such an idiot. He ripped up a ton of really great stuff. The Biden administration, though, when they came into office, did they get back in the deal? No, they didn't. They didn't, because they knew that they'd take too much domestic heat for it. And, you know, that just means, you know, lobbying pressure, you know. But again, you talk to the average American, you know, Iran, oh my God, that's so scary. Don't they have a bunch of nuclear weapons? It's almost pointless to talk to them about it, you know. So I don't know. I mean, wars have started over stupider stuff, and it would be an air war. I mean, who knows? Who knows what would happen? I mean, the Iranians have had the ability, and you know this. This is 1930s technology. They could make a bomb anytime they wanted. They just don't. It's not in their interest to do it. But if they were to start getting attacked more than they are now, you know, it's possible that they would go for it, and who knows what would happen. I mean, there's a reason that North Korea is still chilling there unresolved. Well, there are a couple of reasons, but the fact that they're sitting on a pretty large stockpile of nukes and the missiles to get them where they need to go is certainly a big component of that. So I'm pretty pessimistic about the whole situation.
Well, I could tell you, if I don't think Hezbollah is going to be defeated, but if Hezbollah is, let's just say, if like a situation in Lebanon occurs where Hezbollah is completely, like, you know, they're combat ineffective in Lebanon, I think that the Iranians do pursue nuclear weapons, because if, you know, the Hezbollah is supposed to be their primary deterrent against Israel. If they don't have that, I mean, what other options do they have? And I'm just thinking from a realist point of view, they don't really have many other options.
Yeah. I don't know that Israel is going
unless
to be
the leadership
successful.
decides to kill themselves, which is probably, you know, that's kind of what we're expecting. But it's
no. I mean, the last. I mean, the Israelis have not had a great deal of success going into southern Lebanon in the past. Their forces are very, very stretched, and the wars are. It's tough. I had a chance to talk this summer with a journalist who works for Haaretz, and he said it's a complicated situation because, you know, there are many Israelis who think that the wars are foolish, that a two-state solution would be preferable, but there's enough people who are truly terrified after what happened, that they're willing to basically give Netanyahu's government a blank check. If he says he needs to go into southern Lebanon, then he'll go in there. His approval ratings have actually gone up since he went into Lebanon. So just as you talked about the rally around the flag effect occurring in Iran, the same thing happens in Israel, and so we'll see what happens. I mean, again, I wonder whether or not the Israelis have enough manpower to do what they would like to do. But I guess we'll have to wait and see there.
I mean, the best that they can hope for is really just pushing their problem down, kicking the can down the road a decade, if they were to succeed in whatever they're trying to accomplish right now, because it's not entirely clear. I guess on paper it's to push Hezbollah across the Litani River. However,
yeah, that's a ways away though.
I mean, the issue with that is that, I mean, does pushing them above the Litani River, does that really change the situation that much? Like, they're still gonna, if they exist in, you know, even all the way up in the north of Lebanon, which is not the Shia heartland, but they still have the ability, like, they'll still have the ability to strike northern Italy, strike northern Israel. Like, they still have that ability. It's not like they maybe I'm just completely ignorant of their rocket and missile technology, but from what I've read and from people I've talked to, Hezbollah would still be able to strike from other parts of Lebanon. So it doesn't seem like this. It just seems like it's just a huge quagmire. And I don't know how the Israeli. I mean, I know how the Israeli economy is going to sustain it. It's just going to be through subsidies from the United States. Like, the U.S. is just going to completely prop up their economy as long as this war goes on. Especially, I mean, both parties will do it, but, some say that some people believe that um, the reason why Trump is getting so much institutional support right now is because he would be more willing to partner with Israel in its current wars right now, or to become an even, bigger partner in what they're doing than, what the current Biden administration is willing to be, which is already a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's really incredible too, because of course it was his genius plan, or his son-in-law's genius plan, that really helped to create the conditions for the October 7th attack, that then now he'll be able to even more grossly support, even though it really just makes the normalization of relations with Israel by the countries in question impossible. So it's just baffling. Listening to people talk about Trump and his foreign policy, is so-called accomplishments, is really just another one of those really baffling things, especially being in libertarian circles and stuff. You'll hear people talk, it's like they have this one clip or two of 2015 Donald Trump criticizing the wars of George W. Bush and Barack Obama just on repeat in their head, and they think that that's the guy they're going to get. And it's like, no, the guy who's sucking down Miriam Adelson's money is not the anti-war candidate. The guy who says we're gonna, fight China, that's not the guy. And I know you can find comments where he says, "Oh, we should get along." Trump just says whatever he feels like in the moment. It was his administration that reoriented the government towards fights with China. It was his administration that approved the sending of lethal aid to Ukraine. He's not going to end any of these wars, no matter what he says. We already know that if he tries to interfere with what's going on in Ukraine, he'll be impeached. So,
You think so? Because that's what
I mean, they tried to impeach him for holding up an arms deal the first time, just a totally contrived thing, and it won't stop anyway. I mean, so much of the aid now is flowing through NATO and through the European states. Like, no.
Yeah,
And
I don't know how.
He says, "I'll stop the war with a great deal." Trump's
with a
not going
phone
to put his
call.
name on something that makes him. Yeah, Trump's not going to put his name on anything that makes him look like a loser, right? He's totally in it for himself, and so if he can't get a deal that makes him look great, he'll just let the war keep going on autopilot. And if it fails, he'll just be like, it was Biden's war. It never would have started if I'd been president. So no, I mean, he has zero. I think if we learned anything from Trump's first go round in office, it is that the president does not make the real decisions there, and that Trump does not have the backbone or the intelligence to stand up to the national security state.
Yeah, it's he says with a phone call he'll have the war, he'll
Yeah,
end
I
the
saw
war.
that.
But at this point, the Russians, I think, are pretty, they're just going to fight until all the soldiers in Ukraine are dead. They have the superior numbers, and they can do it. They're just going to fight. And like, what kind of deal do they expect to make? Like, do they think that the Russians are going to give up any territory that they annexed? No. Why would they? If he did that, Putin would be thrown out of office. Like it's you have a country now in Russia where people were enthusiastic about liberalism after the fall of the Soviet Union. People were looking for a direction, and they were looking for America to be a guide. And liberalism has seeped into Russian culture to an underrated degree throughout the last 30 years. But now they look at us with like complete disdain and mistrust, the Russians. It's going to take decades to repair that relationship. It's going to take years to repair that relationship with Russia.
It is a terrible tragedy too, because it didn't need to be that way. There's no
reason to be
it didn't need to be that
war
way
with these people. Let them have their little sphere of influence.
They had an aging population. They were just going to be Europe's gas station. They might meddle a little bit in Ukrainian or Georgian politics, but like, so what? governments meddle in other people's politics all the time, right? Like, no one was killing anybody else, you know? Man, it just did not need to be this way. Didn't need to be this way at all. So, and like you said, I mean, even again, I won't pick on the Wall Street Journal this time. The Washington Post and Wall Street Journal all say the same thing now, which is that both candidates are trying to have more sober, behind closed doors, are trying to have a more sober conversation around what the final outcome in Ukraine can be. Because publicly they say, we're unwavering in our support. Ukraine can never give up its territorial claims. But behind closed doors, they acknowledge that the U.S. doesn't have the weapons to send, don't want to deplete their stockpiles any more than they already have, that the Ukrainians have, quote, manpower shortages, difficulties recruiting. And it's like, you guys, oh man. Yeah. So yeah, it's not going to be, well, what did Jake Sullivan say? I grew up watching Red Dawn. I didn't give it a second thought. Of course I support the Ukrainians because we're the good guys and we always fight the bad guys. And it's like, God.
Is that what he said?
He's such a cartoon character. Yeah, Jake Sullivan said that.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. It was last year.
Yeah, you're dealing with idiots. That's another problem, is that they're not, at least the guys in the Cold War who, I think I texted this to you. George Bush Sr., for all of his faults, he seems like a giant in today's age.
He really
seems like a historical giant.
It's so bizarre. I know. It's true. It's true, man. Yeah.
Like, at least he was, like, informed. Yeah. There was a sense of, like, nationalism. There was a sense of American interest with his policies.
You trusted he could point to the country he was talking about on a map.
Yeah, you could trust that he knew, he goes over to Ukraine and basically tells them, it's like, don't replace, your communist government with another despot. And imagine a president saying that today, like anything like that. You couldn't. Like, the guy was at least informed, and I'm not saying that he was a good person. I'm just saying that he
was a U.S.
at least
president. He was a criminal.
Realist.
Yeah,
to some, and now it's just. I mean, look at our options right now. It's so
trying not to
sad. between
330 million people in this country, and this is what we've got to choose from.
Man, it's like, I mean, I think a lot of people saw this coming with Biden, that this guy was like, his brain was basically oatmeal at this point, and I mean, he's not serving as active president. He's obviously hasn't been. He's been at the beach. I don't know. That's probably just Republican propaganda that I'm consuming right there. But he's obviously not making any decisions whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, he's a very aged fellow. Like, it's not sound for him to be the one making policy.
Yeah, I would be concerned if he was making decisions.
Yeah. So on one hand, yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. Just to your point about who we have the options between. I actually have an article coming out here in the coming weeks. I don't know when Hunter's going to throw it up, but I have long since believed that our best hope for good government in this country, given the current mess that we're in, is election by sortition, meaning that we just draw the names of citizens out of a hat, and you're going to serve one term. So, Henry, your name got pulled out. You are now the senator for New York State. You're going to serve 1 6-year term. And then we're just going to have a bunch of ordinary people randomly drawn out of the hat, and they're going to populate the government. And I feel like there is not the slightest chance that things could go worse than they are actually going now. I think it's impossible. And I give all sorts of historical examples in the article about using sortition to populate the government. And there's like some decent political science literature on it, but I just feel like elections
Wait,
just produce
so
terrible
what are the
outcomes.
historical precedents of doing, like, what other nations or countries have used that method of filling up their legislators?
Many of the Italian republics used sortition. Florentine Republic, the Venetian Republic, the Lucan Republic, the Pisan Republic. These, of course, were the small republics of the late medieval period, early modern period, and of course, they would ultimately be subsumed by their larger neighbors, who carved out spheres of influence at their expense. This is what Machiavelli is warning about, deploring in The Prince. He ends The Prince with that exhortation that would some prince unite Italy and drive out these barbarians, by which he means the French and the Spanish and the Germans.
Yeah, it's barbarians as in foreigners.
Yeah, all the northern barbarians always ruining things for the Italians. No, and of course that's also how ancient Athens, the Athenian democracy, staffed most of its positions. It's not that there's no elective positions at all. There are some elective positions still, but most of the government and most of the functionaries are simply drawn by lot, just randomly drawn. And just to give some examples, like in the Venetian Republic, if you were elected for high office, you served a very short time and you had to pay for all your own expenses. And it was something only the wealthiest citizens were in the drawing for. Whereas if you were going to serve as an administrator, you might serve for a longer period of time and be paid. And again, that was all drawn randomly. So yeah, there's all sorts of. I go into all of the historical examples.
Do you think we have the population, like when they were drawing citizens, like, the local serfs, peasants, their names weren't in the lot, right? It was people of respectable class, right?
Yeah, in most of
I'm
them
just assuming
there was
that it wasn't like the blacksmith or something.
No, you're well. It depends. So the blacksmith would have been part of a guild, and had he lived in Florence, for example, he would have had a vote in his guild, and then his guild would have sent a representative to the guild assembly, and it was basically rule by guild. So the guilds would then vote. So let's say there's a shoemakers guild, blacksmiths guild, traders guild. Every guild, if you're a member of the guild, they get a representative in the assembly, and you as a member will vote for your representative, and then in the assembly, all the individual representatives would vote. There were sometimes simply age requirements, other times there were property requirements, other times there were tax-paying requirements, other times there were occupational requirements. So it really varied. Medieval, early modern Italy is a wonderful petri dish for experiments in Republican government. You can find all sorts of different systems there. Certainly, I think it's somewhat problematic that we have a sort of disconnect in the United States between the electors and the actual burden that they foot, if you will, what their stake is. And of course, this goes back to the dissenters of English Civil War England. Even the meanest man hath a life to lead. That just because they're propertyless doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to vote. At the same time, if you have a very limited, small Republican government, if you make demands of that government to do more and more things, the government must necessarily grow larger and larger and larger and consume ever larger portions of the national income. And it's no secret that fewer than 50% pay income taxes. And we are not on sustainable fiscal trajectory, and it is a wonder whether or not we would be on that trajectory were suffrage based on something other than just universality. So I don't know. I'm open to alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, you got to figure out a way to make the people in the hat whose names are drawn just can't be complete morons. So we have to, that means discriminating against a lot of people, to be completely honest. But nothing can be worse than what we currently have, because now it's just, I mean, they're just whores. That's the only way to describe politics. It's just whoredom, just massive whoredom. Just, you are for sale. Like, you're just it's just bribery. I've always wondered, like, do these people, and this is like a question I'm trying to tackle, are these people just like naturally pieces of shit? Are these
It
pieces of shit who
attracts
seek power, who are just like
it
seek money and
attracts the
influence?
wrong people. That's my biggest gripe with with democracy, is that those who desire power are those who should be least trusted with it. And what do you get in elections? You have people clamoring, "Oh, just give me power, or I'll do anything to have it." And it's like, nope, nope. Anyone who knows anything about incentive structures knows that this is an extreme hazard. Um, there's actually a good book here on this, and so I think it attracts the wrong people. And then I think number two, even if someone who is not interested in behaving in such a way gets into office somehow, they are brought into a hopelessly corrupt culture where refusing to go along with it isn't going to get you anywhere, and you either quit or you learn to go along to get along. And I hate to pick on her, but I'm going to. AOC. AOC is a perfect example of what happens when, a young fiery idealist slips in the door and then gets a taste of what it's like. And I mean, now she's literally just covering for the Biden administration on their policy toward Israel, right? Being a whore. She's had a taste of power, of privilege. She knows that if she just shuts up and goes along to get along, she could be there for a long time, and she could wind up in a position of real power. And it's telling that those who wouldn't shut up about the Democrats' policy in Palestine, people like Jamal Bowman, for example, were primaried right out of the place, right? AIPAC turned on the money spigot, blew them right out of there. So that's what happens. There's a good book.
AOC is not in a safe district either. Like, she could easily lose an election if they. I mean, she's one of the most well-known members of Congress in the country. So maybe she, to some level, she could be immune to that type of political pressure. However, they just, who did they get? Who did they primary? They primary Jamal.
Yep.
Jamal Bowman, and then Cori Bush, right?
And Bush.
Was that the other one?
Look at the difference. Just look at the difference between their statements about the Biden administration's policy towards Gaza and AOC's. And then turn back the clock and see what she'd say. The transformation is all too obvious. It's all too obvious. Yeah. So, which, whatever. I pick on her because she's as you say, very famous, very prominent example. And she stood out. She stood out for being vocal and quote unquote principled. But as we see, principles are always up for sale in Washington, D.C.
So I want to ask you one last question. How do guys like Thomas Massie get into Congress? Because his record is really good. Like, I mean, there's nothing I really haven't seen any red flags. Like, the only thing that you could say is that, he actually had the foresight to know that Mike Johnson was going to be even worse than Kevin McCarthy.
I know, right? And no one would listen to him. Oh.
He was like, "Hey guys, this dweeb here is worse than Kevin McCarthy, because he's a real, like, Kevin McCarthy. He's just like a political animal type guy who I don't think he believes or cares about anything. Mike Johnson is he's Ned Flanders times 100 plus all the negative stereotypes about Republicans. And man, he had that foresight, but he doesn't going back to Massey, he doesn't really have any blemishes. And he went out on Tucker Carlson and he's talking about how everyone in Congress has an AIPAC guy. Is it because he's from like a country rural district?
It's part his district. Yeah. I was just looking at his district map just to check. Yeah, it's in part his district. You know, in part it's the fact that he is very close with some of the frankly more powerful members of the, you know, what was once the Tea Party caucus there. So, you know, he gets committee assignments and whatnot. That is an important thing.
He's a likable guy too, you know.
He's a very smart, likable guy. You know, as I said, he is one of the exceptions. And every cycle, I'm surprised that he doesn't quit, honestly, because he's not enriching himself. He's not helping the country. And eventually, you just wonder if a guy like that's just going to throw up his hands and say, I quit. You know, I follow him on Twitter. He follows me as well. And so I see a lot of his posts. And he very frequently posts stuff like, God, I hate this place. You know what I mean? And he's been there for, gosh, a decade now. And I do just wonder when he's just going to throw up his hands and say, I quit. You know, his record is really very, very good. It's hard to find a bad vote by Thomas Massey. So
that's what Amash did too, right? He just eventually quit.
Well, Amash quit because he was not going to win his primary race. Like, that's, as much as I would love to give Justin Amash credit for being as principled as Thomas Massey, that is not why he quit. He quit because he was going to lose, because he had voted to impeach Trump, and the Michigan GOP was not going to let him get away with that in the midst of a presidential cycle. So he quit. He tried to come back this past year and got crushed by Mike Rogers in the primary for the Michigan Senate seat. I do not dislike Justin Amash. I think he's better than most. But that's the truth about Justin Amash's calculation there. So before you let me go, I just wanted to give you one interesting book if you were interested. It's about democracy and about just sort of alternative voting schemes. You mentioned things like some sort of screening process for voters to make sure they weren't idiots. He has an article about that that he wrote. But this guy's name is Claudio Lopez Guerra, and he wrote this whole book. It's called Democracy and Disenfranchisement: The Morality of Electoral Exclusions. And it was from Oxford University Press. He's a professor of political science over at Richmond. And I've followed his work ever since I was an undergraduate. Oh gosh, what was I forget the name of the first article I read by him, but it was about how to properly, it was something like suffrage by lottery, where basically 2% of 2% of the population would get to vote or something like that, and it would all be random, and there'd be a screening process where people would be asked general competency questions to make sure that they knew what was going on, you know. But it's interesting stuff, I think, and he wrote a whole book about it. So,
well, I thought you were going to say Democracy, the God That Failed.
Oh no, I have read that. Yeah,
I've never read that. That's a book that's always recommended to me by Hans Hermann Hoppe. But I mean, that sounds interesting. Every time you give me a book recommendation, it always derails the current projects I'm working on, because then I'll be like, fuck, this has just changed my perspective, and now I need to rethink how I'm doing this.
Oh, well, I hope you enjoy it if you pick it up. It's a thought-provoking exercise. So, yeah, but I appreciate you having me on today. It's always
Joe,
a pleasure to talk.
Let everyone know where they can find your campaign page, support you, find your articles, and anything else you want to plug.
Sure. So my team made a campaign website, Solis-Mullen for Senate. That is the name of the website. Actually, if you just Google my name, it is now the first thing that pops up, which was a little disappointing. You spend your entire career working as in academia, writing articles, books. You run for one public office, and now Google just calls you an aspiring politician. So, yeah. It went from author. When you Google someone, it gives you like their profession. It literally changed mine from author and professor to candidate for U.S. Senate. So, man, that was a sheer blow. So if you just Google my name,
there could be way worse.
Yeah,
there could be way worse slanders. I mean, so maybe that is the worst slander, aspiring politician.
It is honestly one of the worst things that I can think of for myself personally. I've told several interviewers, because they always ask you, so what makes you qualified for this job? Why should people vote for you? And I always tell them, because I really, really don't want this job. I think that is my most recommending qualification. I don't want this job. I think politicians, especially politicians in Washington, D.C., are absolute scum. And I don't want to be a part of their club. And I don't really fancy sitting alone at the lunch table for 6 years. So, fortunately, there's very little chance I'm going to win. As far as my own work goes, of course, I'm a fellow at the Libertarian Institute. You can follow me there. I actually have a new book coming out next month about the national debt. It's called The National Debt and You. What it is, how it works, and why it matters. Yeah, that's pretty much it. You can follow me at Solis_Mullen on Twitter. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and Joe, when that book comes out, we would love to have you back on, because I don't think most people understand the national debt. Like, people just they're so removed from the consequences of the national debt that they just have no idea how it impacts them. So I think that would be a good opportunity to talk about the book. Make sure, get as many people as possible to read it, and just have another conversation.
I always welcome the opportunity.
All right. Well, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. If you want to support the show, join our Substack, which is in a link. That is going to be the new house where you can find all of our stuff. So we will be posting our episodes without any advertisement on the Substack. We'll also be publishing articles on the Substack. So go subscribe to the Substack. The link will be there. It's pretty easy to find. It's just Substack Bro History, and you will find it. And yeah, peace, guys. Thanks for listening.